Good afternoon. I'm Celeste Langen, Acting Director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities, and it's my privilege to welcome you here this afternoon on behalf of the Townsend Center and our co-host, Cal Performances, which has provided the venue and technical support. It's the decision of Cal Performances to offer financial support for Peter Sellars' project that's responsible for bringing Peter Sellars here to us today, and for the U.S. premiere of Desdemona, his collaboration with Toni Morrison and Rokia Traore, here to Berkeley. Today's lecture by Peter Sellars is the first of two events. We invite you back here tomorrow at the Zellerblock Playhouse at noon for what should be an extraordinary conversation between and among the artist collaborators themselves, but also with the audience and a Berkeley faculty panel from the English Department, Music, and African American Studies. Introducers often suggest that it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce speakers, and I would certainly so testify were I actually up here to introduce Peter Sellars. If you don't already know, you will soon learn what a delightful personality is attached to Peter Sellars' creative genius. But it's my luck to have been appointed acting director of the Townsend Center when the extraordinary previous director, Toni Cascardi, was asked to serve this summer as Dean of Arts and Humanities. Toni's twin commitments to strengthening the bonds between the academy and the public world on the one hand, and the humanities and art practice on the other, have contributed deeply to the vitality and richness of cultural life here at Berkeley. And it was he, together with his former student, Lenore Kitts, a Toni Morrison scholar, who initiated the Townsend Center's participation in the Desdemona premiere. Desdemona is itself a collaboration between artists working in different languages and media to reimagine Shakespeare's Othello, to give a new concept of humanity, to make it relevant to a global society. It's therefore all the more fitting that Toni Cascardi will have the honor of introducing Peter Sellars to you today.
Celeste, thank you very much for that welcome and pre-introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here to introduce Peter Sellars. And in doing so, I also want to celebrate the collaborations that we have now begun really in earnest between Cal Performances and the Division of Arts and Humanities and other academic institutions on the campus, and to offer to you this series of events, this lecture, tomorrow's panel discussion, and the performances by Peter Sellars as an example of that kind of collaboration is something that I believe Peter is very deeply committed to, and I couldn't imagine a greater, better partner. I don't often begin introductions in any anecdotal fashion, but for some reason, my first meeting with Peter Sellars has been so indelibly etched in my consciousness that I can't think of Peter or speak about him without recalling that occasion. It was in the hallways outside of the offices of the then Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism, Orville Schell, where I saw a figure coming down the corridor at some distance. And in spite of the length of that hallway, there was something in the energy that was being projected at me from the figure advancing down it that I just could not help but notice. It was just a sheer aliveness and radiance of energy. It felt like a kind of electricity that instantly shrunk the distance of that hallway. And I just couldn't begin to imagine what creativity was attached to it. And we hadn't even said hello yet. In characteristic Peter fashion, it wasn't a conventional hello. It was a big embrace. It was an expression of his availability, of his willing to meet others and collaborate with them. That was as if a moment of collaboration happening before we had even begun a conversation. His willingness to imagine, to discuss, to co-conspire, to co-create with people of all types. It was truly remarkable. And I think that all of this is co-creating and co-imagining and co-conspiring, imagining and reimagining has been really the hallmark of his career. Now, Peter required me to leave the 20-page version of this introduction in my seat. So what you have is the very, very distilled version of this, but there are some things I told him I genuinely wanted to say, not just about highlights of his career, but about the way he approaches art making as I understand it. From very early on, he gained a reputation as a daring and imaginative reinterpreter of some of the classics. I think Antony and Cleopatra in the swimming pool at Adam's house when he was an undergraduate at Harvard was probably the first for Antony and Cleopatra, and probably the first for swimming pools. Beyond that, the reinterpretations of drama and also of opera, a production of King Lear, for instance, that included a Lincoln Continental on the stage, or a version of Mozart's Così fan tutte set in a diner on Cape Cod, or The Marriage of Figaro in a luxury apartment in New York City's Trump Tower, or Don Giovanni in Spanish Harlem. And all this imagining, reimagining, creating and recreating, engagement in the making are genuinely the hallmarks of Peter's work. As many of you here in Berkeley in the Bay Area know, he directed and wrote the libretto for John Adams' powerful opera, Dr. Atomic, which drew largely on historical materials. He's been widely recognized for his work, no surprise. In 1998, awarded the Erasmus Prize for his work bridging European and American cultural traditions in opera and theater. And in 2005, the Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize, given annually, and I'll read a few words from the citation, to a man or woman who has made an outstanding contribution to the beauty of the world and to mankind's enjoyment and understanding of life. He has done many things over the course of his unbelievably active and intense career, but I want to single out something that might not ordinarily rise to the top of the list in his credits, in part because it's not a production or a theatrical credit. It's his position as professor of world arts and cultures at UCLA, where he customarily teaches two courses, Art as Social Action and Art as Moral Action. I think those titles really speak volumes about the way Peter views art in the world and in relation to the issues that are at stake in the world around us. For him, art is a form of engaged action. But it's also a form of truth-telling. When Peter wrote Dr. Atomic, his goal was to create what was called a documentary opera. But I think it was not just for the novelty of making a documentary opera, which sounds kind of intriguing and interesting, but for the value of truth-telling. Likewise, I think his interest in Shakespeare's Desdemona and in the stories that Desdemona's made is an interest in truth-telling, or at least reflects an interest in truth-telling. In this particular case, where he's worked closely with Toni Morrison, truth-telling brings things that have been concealed out into the open, allowing us to hear the songs and the words and the stories that come to us from somewhere else, somewhere in this case outside the European tradition. I also think it's entirely appropriate that these voices may come to us, may present themselves under the guise of some kind of fiction. But that only underscores for me the role of fiction in truth-telling. They come to us, nonetheless, as embodied fictions, not just imagined, but as made tantalizingly real by the virtue of Peter's work. Sometimes I wonder what it must be like, what it might be like to work from inside Peter's creative mind and set of talents. But who better to tell us about that than Peter himself? Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming over today. And thank you, Toni, for that just shocking introduction that I'm still recovering from. And Celeste, thank you for your fabulous acting capacity. Long may it last. I have to say, I love the Townsend Center, and it was really my first place that I got my foothold at Berkeley. And I was in residence there for a year, and it was one of the most memorable years of my life, and actually an incredible body of work came out of it. That year there was a collaboration of physicians running the doctors running the main terminal wards at the San Francisco hospitals, and artists on cultural understanding. There was a situation where it's one of those very few times where science reaches its limit. Because, we've been through a century that imagined science can solve everything, and of course there's a whole bunch of things that science just can't discuss or deal with, like how much you love your grandmother. What the Buddhists would call, the immeasurables, non-scientific knowledge, things that don't have a quantity. And they were figuring out in those terminal wards that they had all the equipment for somebody to be in a hospital room as they end their life. But they just, still, that equipment couldn't answer the question of what is a good death. What does it mean to die well? That's a question that has to be understood culturally. And we're in a period where, the humanities were truly erased from the national diet, in a kind of astonishing way. And even our president in the State of the Union last year said he hopes young people across America will become engineers and scientists. And you want to say, well, excuse me, they can help design the weapons that will bomb Libya, but they can't tell you what to do after that. There are a whole bunch of other things that really need to be discussed in the humanities by human beings, and that we are in a country that has not had the humanities for 20 years means that we are in a country that is less humane than the country 20, 25 years ago. And so I'm just grateful for the Townsend Center for the Humanities for keeping it there and insisting at Berkeley, because things get here like other places, slightly compartmentalized. The Townsend Center is a place that keeps everything fluid and that keeps different people meeting outside of their usual boxes. And to me, that is the project of the 21st century. As Toni said, and thank you, Toni, is collaboration. And the question of the 21st century is, how will we share the planet? In what combinations? How do we organize that? What are the protocols? What is the active imagination of sharing? And what are the actual hardcore realities of sharing? Water rights, air, all kinds of stuff. But also our destinies, because our destinies are now, of course, linked. Can't pretend they aren't. So for me, the work of an artist right now is to function collaboratively and to demonstrate the possibilities of collaborative exchange, and to gather a group of people who do see things differently and invite them to find a shared space that does move across contradiction and does move across difficulty, but also shows that people are willing to do that. And what's so great about the arts is nobody actually has to die in order to have a conversation. Nobody has to lose their homes. It actually can be a difficult process, but everyone survives. So that's just a little bit about some of what I think is the next body of work for all of us. And I think all of us want to work beyond our disciplines, beyond our skill set. I think all of us have to work beyond our disciplines and beyond our skill sets. And that vulnerability of being in a place where you're not comfortable and you don't know what to order on the menu is actually thrilling. And obviously, as you know in your own life, when all of us have traveled, it's when you discover yourself is when you're surrounded by people who are not your usual set of people. And you find yourself saying things you had not previously imagined. And you discover other selves that you've been carrying with you that wouldn't have surfaced in your usual set of friends. And to me, all of those acts of deliberately, and the protocols involved with entering spaces that are shared, entering with invitations. What are the terms of the invitations? What's where is the basis of reciprocity? I've been in a very, very fortunate situation most of my life, is that I don't visit places as a tourist. I'm always there to contribute something. And so there's always some kind of reciprocity that's built into my presence at a certain location. All of which is just to say, this guy Shakespeare called his theater the Globe. And that really did interest him. He truly was interested in the Globe. And that's what was on his mind really profoundly. And of course, the plays that he wrote set in Venice are the famous multicultural plays that were about the invention of colonialism, the invention of globalization. You know, the Dutch East India Company is 1601, and Shakespeare's writing Merchant of Venice, right? And then on top of that, 1603, Othello. And he's using Venice as this cosmopolitan stand-in for London, because Shakespeare, knew enough, something that we're going to have to learn again as American artists is, because when we grew up, we thought you could just speak your mind. Now you realize you better have a code, and you better have an out clause, and you better say, oh, this is set in a mythological country somewhere else. In any case, Shakespeare's Venice, of course, Venice is the classic European city that's not European. It's floating, it's drifting, it's sinking. It's as close to China, closer, than it is to Rome. It has all of these really rich, intense, deep cultural links that come from business. And the amazing range in which the world is present. And Shakespeare is one of the first people to discuss all the gold and jewels that are responsible for our image of, European court culture and those magnificent buildings, and to say, well, where did they come from? They came from a mine in Chile. They came from Mexico. They came from South Africa. Shakespeare is very intent on showing you where everything came from and talking about Europe's relation to where everything came from. His imagination is really active, and at the same time, he's reading the travelogues that exist in his time. And of course, those travelogues are, by today's standards, well, no, I shouldn't say that. By today's standards, I'm sure there are a lot of wacky travelogues that are being published now, but nonetheless, slightly approximate. And as you know from those pictures of what they thought the Earth looked like, and the maps that were being proposed of what was available to be discussed, they are fantasy worlds. I mean, they're, the actual geography in Shakespeare's lifetime was a fantasy geography. And so the monsters and strange peoples that inhabit the corners of the world were amazing in travelogues published in Shakespeare's lifetime. Nonetheless, he absorbed them, and one of the most important travelogues is the journal biography of Leo Africanus, who was an extraordinary figure, generation before Shakespeare's, and a mysterious figure to this day, who was from North Africa, Muslim in North Africa, arrived after a series of elaborate ventures to be the keeper of the Muslim books at the Vatican as a devout Catholic. And then at the end of his life, he left the Vatican and went back to Africa, where he was a Muslim again. And the classic European question, is he a Muslim or a Christian? Became the basis of the first novel of Amin Malouf, where the answer to identity is that you are all of the above. And Amin really proposed in his novel, where he reimagined Leo Africanus, this very, very rich palette of human possibility, of what it means to be a citizen in a multifaceted and also, I would say, composite universe, where you're having to function in certain ways and in different ways in very different situations. And all of those things are true. It's not that you're lying here and then you're being your real self there, but in fact, all of these things become a composite reality, which is what is really rich about being alive in the 21st century. So those composite realities become very, very interesting. I think Shakespeare was obsessed with them, which is why he wrote poetry. These huge poetic texts that lead you into layer after layer after layer of identity. The end of his life, Shakespeare, end of his writing period, the tragedies, the final phase of the romances, Shakespeare is a rather angry person. This is a man who is so angry at the absence of justice in the world, is beside himself. Hamlet, you can tell he's irritated. But he's using his irritation as a philosophical question. Othello, he's not just irritated, he is enraged. And Lear, he is so furious that he is taken out his own side. And he's so angry at the whole world in the absence of justice. And Timon of Athens is just too bitter even to open the page. And finally, Shakespeare realizes he can't keep going that way, and he turns and makes those last romances. But I really want to focus on this period of rage, since we're in the famous period of rage in America, of what does it mean to be this angry? And Shakespeare wrote these very angry plays in which you saw really powerful, interesting people sidelined by their own ability to be interesting people. And at the end of each of these plays, some horrible mediocrity takes over. Fortinbras shows up at the end of Hamlet, right? Cassio finally gets the job at the end of Othello. I mean, it's disgusting. And you watch the interesting people being removed from political life and being actually eliminated by their own decisions. And then you watch nightmare mediocrities step in. And the play ends with the nightmare mediocrity appearing in the last 10 lines. After the play was 5 hours long, the last 10 lines you're handed a mediocrity, which I think Shakespeare meant to have the audience go marching into the streets, furious, and not accept the ending. The ending is so unacceptable, and I think Shakespeare was really playing on how unacceptable this ending is. In the case of the topic that we're on today, these late plays of Shakespeare, he's thinking a lot about women, and the women he most admires are silent. And in fact, the characters Shakespeare most admires are silent, which is really tricky because we're, again, as I mentioned earlier, living in a quantitative period where we tend to think that the person who has more lines is more important. And in Shakespeare, it's exactly the opposite. In the play Coriolanus, that's another really awful play from the end that I didn't mention, where, again, you have Volumnia going on forever, destroying everything she touches, and you have Virgilia, who Shakespeare admires very clearly, barely saying a word. That is extended in Ophelia and extended further into Desdemona. Desdemona barely says anything across the whole night. She's present for a lot, but you don't hear what she thinks about it. And then, of course, Shakespeare goes one step farther in Lear, and you have Cordelia, who just barely says, the word nothing. And so Shakespeare has these extraordinary women, but he doesn't have them speak. And the measure of his admiration for them is how silent they are. Toni Morrison feels somewhat differently about this topic. She likes a woman to speak her mind, and in fact, it's required. And so for me, one of the questions of looking at Shakespeare 400 years later is one of the first steps. It's also what we deal with looking at the Greek plays is, okay, now what about the women? We really ask a set of questions now about the women that in many cases Shakespeare can't answer. And if you go at the question of what is the globe, our globe doesn't look like those funny fantasy maps that Shakespeare was basing his world on. So 400 years later, as brilliant as Shakespeare is, there are a bunch of things simply that were missing information for Shakespeare, or information he chose to withhold, or for his own moral purposes decided was not important. So Desdemona's power and courage in Shakespeare, and Desdemona is one of Shakespeare's most brilliant, inspired creations, is her capacity to suffer silently. People who we can tell are in agony, but their measure of their stature as a human being is they don't complain, and they don't share their anguish with the people around them. But their very stoic nature means that they're noble. And Shakespeare's definition of nobility was to suffer silently, was to not make an issue. In the case of Desdemona, we have a really complicated play because Othello, for me, is a play I've had a lot of difficulty with across my lifetime, and people will stop me if I'm repeating something that I've said too often in public, but just to get the ball rolling of how this project came to be, I've never been able to stand Shakespeare's Othello. It's just an awful play, and it's badly motivated, and it's truly disturbing in ways that I don't find entirely creative. And I was telling this to Toni Morrison one day we were having lunch at Princeton. As you know, one of the things at Princeton that you tend to do is have very long lunches. And so the lunch is going on, and I finally just mentioned this play by Shakespeare, and I say, there's one play written by Shakespeare that's not very interesting. Or in fact, it's a bad play, and it is Othello. And Toni then spent 4 hours telling me how wrong I was, quoting the play from memory and saying, among other things, what I remember particularly from that day is she said, being in America today, it's not that they kill what you love. It's that they convince you to kill it. And this is the language that they use. And that is the language of Dick Cheney. It is the language of, this was 10 years ago when we were talking. And she felt that this was really crucial material to be performed in our era. And she challenged me to do a production of the play. I challenged her back to respond to Shakespeare and put in all the things that are missing. For example, Hamlet, the play before, has more soliloquies than any play ever written. You get to be with that guy. And you can figure out who he is, probably have a better chance than he does. On the other hand, Othello is alone for 10 lines in the entire play. You have no idea who he is alone when he's not performing for people. You never meet him with his food, his people, his music, his anything. He's just the performing being in front of the audience of scene after scene after scene. Now that's really striking, to go to this complete extreme from Hamlet of endless introspection and questions of identity to this person who's just a cipher, an object in a scene with other people acting and reacting. And of course, the play has stood for 400 years, again, in a fairly racist context to reinforce the idea that as the single great work of Western culture that involves a black man, quote unquote, the presence of a black man in the West is a permanent tragedy involving violence in a scenario that D.W. Griffith could have come up with. So those parts of the play I find very disturbing. And I asked Toni to answer that and to maybe let Othello breathe in his own skin and let him breathe in his own life. Now, I should just mention 2 other quick things, and then we'll dive in. And I'm going to ask, we're going to get into a discussion in a minute because there's lots to talk about, but I'm just going to give you 2 more items of history. 1990, I was running the Los Angeles Festival, and one of the most important things we did was we invited a group of Cambodians to come and perform in America just after the end of the killing fields. And it took a lot of work. We had to get the State Department to issue non-humanitarian visas for the first time ever for Cambodian citizens. And what we tried to bring was the Cambodian court dance to America. That was because in Long Beach, we had the largest population of Cambodians living outside of Cambodia, people who had come during the genocide with family members missing, limbs missing, in a really extreme state. They founded the United Cambodian Community, where before they had English lessons, job placement, or housing, they started a dance academy to teach their kids classical Cambodian dance, because no matter where on earth they were, their Cambodianness could not be taken away from them, and that was expressed by how they moved. So it was urgent to bring from Cambodia, at the end of the Pol Pot period, dance. Pol Pot had targeted the dancers because they were part of his image of the entourage of the royal court. He murdered all the dancers in a 2-week period and burned all the sets and costumes, and a 1,000-year tradition was eliminated. 2 older women survived, lived in pigsties for 3 years. Eventually, after the massacres, started teaching a new generation of dancers. Now it takes a generation to teach that dance. They couldn't do any complete ballets because they just didn't exist. So they could only do what we used to call in the opera world highlights. So there would be 3 minutes of this ballet, 4 minutes of that ballet. And these were kids. These were kids coming out who had been living in the fields starving to death and who were shaking, and and they came to Long Beach, California, and performed excerpts of Cambodian ballets and operas. And the performances were not good. They were really weak because there was no tradition. And yet, sitting in the audience, all we could do was just weep and weep and weep. It was overwhelming. And one of those young women, one of the young students in that tour, married one of the tour organizers and stayed in America as Sopheline Shiam Shapiro. And she went to Santa Monica College, and in her English comp class, they read Othello by William Shakespeare. And she said, "This is an amazing statement about the status of women." 10 years later, she went back to Phnom Penh, and she choreographed the first full-length Cambodian ballet, Othello. She made it into a piece of Cambodian culture. There was no way to show blackness in Cambodia, so she made Othello a giant. All the roles are danced by women, except Othello, who of course was, except Iago, who of course was a monkey. And the biggest change she made was the end, because her generation had seen enough killing. At the end of the play, Desdemona and Othello were together. Othello enclosed them both in a circle of fire through eternity. And Othello knelt to Desdemona and apologized. And that's how the play ended. Because Sopheline, who had lived through the killing fields, didn't want to see any more killing. And because she felt no one had ever apologized to her generation, and she needed to hear an apology. So she staged one. That was the Cambodian Othello. As the artistic director of the Venice Biennale, I brought it to Venice. The Lion of Venice came from Cambodia. We performed it in the Arsenale, where the original Othello's army was headquartered. And in order to present it to the European press, I've learned you need to set up something so people have a way of coming to certain material. So I invited 2 authors to introduce this rather unusual version of Othello. And I invited Amin Maalouf to speak about being a person of color in Europe and the details of the Leo Africanus biography and the ways in which they intersect Shakespeare. And I invited Toni Morrison to come and see and talk about the Cambodian Othello, which she loved. She, and so Pauline went at it, she loved a feminized version of Othello, where it was about the women. And it was suddenly about, as Pauline had seen the play, about a systematic culture of violence against women. The military culture of the play, of course, but also the women in the play are systematically terrorized. And to look at the status of women in that play is really shocking, and just to think of it as a women's play. That got Toni one step farther towards thinking of this in feminized terms. Then Toni said to me, okay, now you have to do Othello, which I did 2 years ago, a production with Philip Seymour Hoffman and John Ortiz that we did first in Europe and then in New York in Obama's first term, which was very, very complicated. It was hated. It was truly destroyed by the New York Times. And it was interesting because it was a play that I assumed was not relevant. And when we started rehearsing the play, Obama was not yet president. And then in the course of performances, Obama was the president of the United States. And we were doing a play written 400 years ago about a black man who rises to the highest position of power of any black man in history, and suddenly, inexplicably, a giant conspiracy starts from everyone, including his friends, to make sure he will not succeed. And as we were doing that, the first Obama-Hitler posters were appearing. And this play by Shakespeare that I had assumed was out of date was really shockingly pertinent. Indeed, the very elusiveness of the conspiracy itself, that is to say, it wasn't an official conspiracy, it's something weirder than that. Shakespeare shows you human beings having a lie in front of them and the truth, both equally available, will click on the lie. It's a human thing. And so the question of, is Obama an American citizen? Like, hello, I think we know the truth of that by now, but the lie keeps going unstoppably. And so suddenly this play turned into something really shocking for us working on it. Toni came to rehearsals. At the same time, there were certain things that I felt we were not able to deal with in treating the play, even as we treat it as contemporarily as possible, because there are just so many, the play is so mysterious. And I think one of the hardest things about Shakespeare in this late phase of Shakespeare is the truths are so hidden. So I've called this talk Toni Morrison and Shakespeare's Hidden Women. And we might as well just get to Shakespeare's idea of hidden, because, as in Joyce, as in a lot of literature, beauty is hidden. Something is beautiful by definition of the fact that it's hidden. If it's available, then it is not beautiful. And Shakespeare's idea of beauty is that you have to search for it. It's treasure. It doesn't meet the eye. It is elusive. It's what you first didn't like, and later you find is treasure. It's what you were wrong about. And Shakespeare's very intent on setting up, obviously in Merchant of Venice, all that glisters is not gold, and the idea that if you're picking the gold, you picked the wrong thing, and if you picked the lead, you got the real treasure. And Shakespeare goes out of his way to set up those tropes. Othello is a very extreme case of these bizarre reversals. Starting with Toni to work on how we could move this play forward into our own history, but also away from a racist formulation. Toni's first impulse was, of course, start with women and let the women speak. We all know the truth that as soon as men leave the room, women speak differently. There's another conversation that begins. And so Toni's first step was to have Iago not present, because Iago so dominates the play, Shakespeare's play, and to finally let these women speak. And in the play, Toni identified several types of silence and silencing of women. And One is Desdemona's nobility of she's thinking and feeling things, but she won't say them. Maybe even to herself. And the other side is Emilia, the woman who is the keeper of the handkerchief, the famous handkerchief lie that creates the havoc of total violence. She knows the handkerchief, she knows the real story. At any time, she could just say, oh, no, that's not a real story. She could identify the lie at any moment and prevent all of the murders, including her own. She doesn't, she's silent. Why is that woman silent? What intimidates that woman that she won't speak the truth? When in Shakespeare's play, Emilia is present in almost every scene of the play. He lists her at the beginning, at the head of every scene as present, but she has no lines. Over and over again through the entire play. She's present but silent. Is she frightened of her husband, Iago? What explains her silence? Is she one of those women who's brutalized into silence? Does she feel she's saving herself? In what way is she complicit with getting Desdemona and then herself murdered on a completely trumped up charge? Shakespeare, of course, is obsessed with that. Why were the German people silent in the 30s? Why are the American people silent? Beginning of the 21st century, we're fighting these wars based on obvious lies. Why don't people just challenge these lies? And the vacuum of the silence that doesn't call a lie. And the usual fascist empires rise on very racist lies. The lies are the same racist lies. They come back over and over again. People know they're wrong, and yet they get repeated, and then the murders begin. And Shakespeare's Emilia is, I think, the key emblem of that type of silence and that type of, what Toni calls murderous silence. So to make this production, I should mention two things we did. One is we invested the set budget in microphones. And these are extremely high quality microphones. Because if Toni was going to have these women finally speak, then I wanted to really hear them. And I wanted to hear them not crudely, but in detail and in intimacy. And to me, there are two types of microphones that are in use right now, and I think both of them are parallel. One is the movements that are happening in the streets all over the world right now, where people are shouting slogans into microphones. Those slogans have a limited truth content. I mean, they have an urgent truth content, but a limited truth content. And to me, I need the other side of it, which is a truth that's more intimate, more private, that testifies to a deeper range of emotion, deeper range of imagination, a deeper range of possibility, and more intimate, intricate histories. So that's why we have these super expensive microphones, because obviously in America, if you hear anybody's voice, it's because somebody paid for it. Right? You're listening to money talk. That is the sound of money. Any voice that reaches you, somebody paid for it. And that's, of course, the joy of the internet, is breaking apart that idea that speech is money and adjusting it. Nonetheless, I wanted these women to speak. Toni's idea, which was really, of course, from her earlier work, is that these women were speaking from the other side of the dead, of the grave. That the space on the other side of the grave gave them space to finally reflect, understand. I mean, Desdemona, after all, was married to Othello on Tuesday and murdered on Wednesday evening, so there was not a whole lot of reflective time for her, so she needed a space. Now, when I say these women, I've mentioned Emilia, but I haven't mentioned Barbary. Let me just quickly say what Barbary is doing in this piece. And then let's open this up a little bit. Barbary is one of Shakespeare's hidden women. Shakespeare plays always frequently mention women, and we never meet them. And, there's a big question, was Shakespeare the father of daughters? And what happened to all the mothers in Shakespeare? And those are all interesting questions of hidden women all the way through Shakespeare. Where are they? Who are they? And a lot of Shakespeare mother references are pretty charged. In any case, in this play, in the fourth act, Othello is a very loud play. The men are yelling a lot. Finally, they leave, and there are just two women left on stage, Desdemona and Emilia. Desdemona knows something horrible is about to happen. Othello has just been there, threatened her, and left. She's getting ready for bed. She asks Emilia, prepare my nightgown, turn down the bed. And she says, for some reason, Emilia, this song keeps going through my head. I can't get rid of it. I learned it from my maid, Barbary, who died while singing it of a broken heart. And then she sings the famous Willow song. Actually, I'm leaving out one thing. I learned it from my mother's maid, Barbary. So the word mother is in the same sentence. And that's a rather interesting and powerful reference from Shakespeare. Shakespeare has in Act 1 shown you that Senator Brabantio, Desdemona's father, doesn't know his own daughter. He keeps talking about some other girl, and she keeps saying, no, Dad, that's not me. And you can pretty much get that, like most senators, he's raising money every night and is not raising his kids. And so the Black Help is doing that. What's powerful? My mother's maid, Barbary, who died while singing it of a broken heart. The word Barbary in 1600 in England means Africa. The Barbary pirates were hijacking British naval ships and enslaving the crews in North Africa. And the British press then as now was outraged and said, Britons are meant to be free, Africans are meant to be slaves. And it was a shock that white people were being enslaved in Africa. In 1600, a delegation from the Barbary coast came to London, and it was the first time Londoners had seen Africans of high degree. They arrived as an official embassy, magnificently dressed, and were escorted to the palace where they met with Queen Elizabeth for a high-level negotiation of exchange of prisoners and slaves. This visit was widely commented on in the London press, and so for Shakespeare in 1603 in Othello to use the term Barbary was sending a message, Africa. And then, of course, when you read that out and you imagine that Desdemona, Shakespeare's most inspired creation of this independently minded, generous, thoughtful woman, courageous, going against her family and their traditions, was raised by an African woman on African stories and African songs. And that's Shakespeare. And there's the other mysterious African in Othello. And a hint to Desdemona responding so deeply to Othello when he walks in is she recognizes something about him. Her upbringing prepared her for his stories and prepared her for the songs. So there's already some cultural link and some historical bond. And of course, Shakespeare's image that this African woman died while singing of a broken heart is a pretty intense premonition of Desdemona herself. And that your death is not just the violence at the hands of some man, but it's actually a broken heart. It's disappointment in that man. That the violence isn't just physical, but the murderous violence is emotional. That someone dies of a broken heart, not just strangulation. So that sentence became the starting point for Shakespeare's women to finally speak in Toni Morrison's words, and for them to speak from the other side of the grave using microphones. I just wanted microphones because for me this idea of when you hear the voices of the dead, they are disembodied. So I wanted the voices to be in the room and slightly separated from the bodies of the performers so that they had other lives that were not linked to the performers' bodies. The project took on new life a year and a half ago when we asked Rokia Traoré to collaborate. Rokia is one of the great Malian singers. She lives in Bamako. Toni had written a few initial scenes, and Toni showed them and talked them through with Rokia. Rokia went back to Bamako, came up with 3 songs, and then across the year it's gone back and forth between the 2 women. Rokia writing another song or 2, Toni writing another few scenes, each woman seeing what the other has written and then responding. Toni rewriting a scene after she gets one of Rokia's song texts, because Toni's never had an African woman respond back while she's writing. And so that was a very charged and exciting experience. And meanwhile, for Rokia, in Mali, Toni's language is very tense. And, as I don't have to probably tell you here, there's just almost no public education in Mali at all, and 80% of Malians are illiterate. And the language skills it takes to read a Toni Morrison text are very intense. And we had a lot of really intense discussions with the performers from Mali about what Toni is saying and how she's saying it and how that's understood from the point of view of an African woman, one of the African women on this stage. So those acts of translation were, some of them, of course, online, and that's what's so thrilling about the internet, is Toni Morrison and Rokia can send each other messages and download MP3 files. So Toni can listen to Rokia's new songs in her house while she's writing in New York and while Rokia's writing in Bamako. So those women speaking across continents and histories and so on, as we've said, actually was possible because of the internet, but also possible because, unlike Shakespeare, we do have African friends. Africa's not so far away anymore. It's a very different presence in all of our lives. And it's really time to stop imagining Africa and start dealing with Africa as reality rather than fantasy. Shakespeare's Othello deals with Africa as fantasy, and we thought it was extremely important with this project to stop dealing with Africa as fantasy and to deal with Africa as its own present reality. And again, having no one ventriloquize for Africa, but letting the African presence speak for itself on its own terms. And at the same time, have Africa not just in a male voice, but finally in a voice of a woman. Rokia created the body of songs, and I would just emphasize Toni's writing process we can get into in a minute. I just would call your attention to Rokia's writing process, which is quite extraordinary. Because, of course, the African tradition is you make new things out of old things. You don't just start new, but something is evolving and handed on and becomes something new. So Rokia, for example, took a classic song about 200 years old about a gorgeous warrior who's handsome and beautiful and perfect and just has one flaw. He tends to get angry. And she adopted that into the most amazing, strange, slow dance for Othello and Desdemona on their first meeting. And you get the resonance of the traditional epic story that's in the background, but she's adapted it for Othello, and meanwhile she's turned it into this strange hallucinatory dance where already in the first time Desdemona and Othello meet and dance, Rokia is there saying, please don't get angry, Othello, don't ruin this. So Rokia's use of that song at that moment gives you that classic African perspective where time is moving in three directions simultaneously. The song is able to speak both retrospectively and prophetically. The song is able to set up a certain moment, and at the same time, exactly because the song already has a long history, it's operating in an epic continuum. Another song that Rokia has completely transformed is a classic West African song called Dongori. Dongori refers to it's a vine with thorns. And there was a famous warlord whose response to virgins who refused to sleep with him was to wrap them in a shroud made of a fabric of this vine of thorns, so they would die being pierced all over their bodies as they were wrapped and buried alive in this fabric. And it became an image in West Africa for your wedding veil will become your burial shroud. And the actual, what it meant to get married, is you will be wrapped in this cloth of thorns and buried alive. Rokia turns that song around completely. She makes an up-tempo version of the famous lament, and she gives completely new words to three young women who say, I refuse this, I break the knot, I refuse to live this way. Mother, forgive me. Father, forgive me. I will not live that way anymore. And she turns that song into a completely new direction. So I think we can all, those of us who know Shakespeare's Othello, can discuss the way in which Toni Morrison reimagines it. I just wanted to mention a couple of African examples that probably we have less context for, that also let you know Rokia is also imagining back and forth in history and reinventing what her generation of women needs at this moment to articulate their own future and their own sense of forward momentum. And so Toni's project and Rokia's project are quite parallel. Okay, now finally, before we just open this thing up, Toni, how many people have seen this thing? How many people are seeing it tonight? Okay, great. Well, I don't want to ruin everything, so I have to split this somehow. Okay. I think one of Toni's important projects with this was to create a feminine space. And I think it's one of my favorite things about the performance itself, is it's a space held by women, and it's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's really an unusual project. It's literature and music. It's not exactly theater. It operates in a slightly different way. And my hope is that it's a spacious performance. I think we're surrounded by too much information coming at us all the time. And for me, what I'm hoping we're able to do with this performance is, between the literature and the music, create a wide open space for reflection, imagination, looking back at history, understanding something, and then making a different choice moving forward. And we're able to create that space where those possibilities are real. Toni, of course, said that for the dead, the past and the future are the same. And that was her permission to write in prophetic and in retrospective voices. But the other thing that I think Toni really had in mind was very heightened diction. So these women spoke with a kind of poetic, charged power. Because I think one of the most powerful things about Shakespeare is just that we're expressing something in poetry. And what poetry offers, as Aristotle would say, poetry is, well, history is about what happened, poetry is about what might happen. That idea that something might happen, that it's wide open. Toni took Shakespeare as a wide open space from which to move into and beyond. And I think she also wanted the pleasure of language itself to be paramount. Certainly, Rokia gets her points across through pleasure. One of Rokia's points when she's working with the musicians is she will not let them be harsh or ugly at any time. Everything is drilled and worked on till it's smooth, it's delicate, it's subtle, it's not overstated, it's understated. It becomes, I think, for Rokia, as Rokia would say, in Africa, we all know Africa is run by women, but it's just better not to say so. And because it just doesn't help. But in fact, exactly the song that I find so moving about Othello, which is the African tradition of the praise song, which is if somebody's behaving really badly, you don't just say they're horrible, but you find a way of praising them. You find a way, because if somebody's behaving badly, they're feeling badly. They're not actually feeling good about themselves. And what praise does to shift human behavior is much deeper than condemnation. And in fact, most people want pleasure and will move towards it. And the tradition of the African griot is you invite rulers to go forward into a place of pleasure and renown and not backward into a place of sadness and regret. And so the choices are made musically to go forward into a beautiful realm. And that beauty is always held in front of us. And I think both Toni and Rokia have in mind the sheer beauty of texture as part of the evening, which we've added to by the beauty of the women present. Now, does that give you some sense of the landscape of what we're talking about? What I'd love to do is get into more specific questions. That lays out a little bit of the project. And I would love to open it up, because it's time, Celeste, right? It is way over time. Yes, let's just go into it. Yes, please, yes, in the front row here.
Well, I'm so much enjoying this role that you're on, so that's great. And it's fitting to remind us of Shakespeare's mode. That's a great start point. You said, did I misunderstand you? You said that the more Shakespeare admires a character, and I'm assuming you mean a female character, the more noble she is, the less she talks. But you don't want to forget Juliet, who has so many beautiful lyric knowledge.
Right.
Stuff about her sensuality, what Cleopatra. So it's not all about Shakespeare. You didn't mean that.
Yes, somebody's saying, do I mean all of Shakespeare's women? What about Juliet? What about Cleopatra? Hello. They do have a few lines. I'm really speaking of this narrow group of tragedies that are at this kind of nodal point, and particularly the plays on either side of Othello, which are Hamlet and Lear. And this particularly angry, intense place Shakespeare is in with these three plays, and I do think that there's a pattern. I just think you can look at the women in those three plays and you can detect. Yes.
Doesn't
this statement, it never occurs to Amelia that the handkerchief has a significance until Desdemona's dead on the bed. That is actually not true. The weird thing is, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's as in life as in art, everybody knows everything. They act like they don't know, of course, but they know. And that's in the play very specifically. And I have to say, we did a version of this play, very close reading of Amelia in particular, in which, among other things, she is actually having an affair with Othello, while Othello is married to Desdemona. That is to say, and that's in the play. I mean, it's buried, but it's present. And in fact, it's a nightmare because Amelia is competitive with Desdemona for Othello in very strange ways. And there's a really scary moment where, in fact, that's why in this famous Willow scene, Amelia gives this long speech to Desdemona about everything she would do to improve her status, including sleeping with Desdemona's husband, which is a shocker. And so, in fact, everybody does know everything. And what somebody we worked on the production with said, it's like Clinton staffers, right? They've all slept with each other in every combination, and they all know everything about the other, and they're all insanely competitive. And so there's, behind polite veneer, is all kinds of other stuff going on. That's what I mean about Shakespeare, is you have to read it so closely because there's stories inside the stories, and anything anybody's claiming is, by the virtue of the fact they're claiming it, not true. And so you always have to get into what's behind that claim, and why would somebody go ahead and make that claim. One of the other things I would mention that Toni has gone to enormous trouble to do is to get to why people won't speak about certain things. What is there between Othello and Iago that keeps them in some kind of weird bond, and at the same time that they hate each other so much? What is that? Toni really went and imagined that. One of her most amazing insights about Amelia is that Amelia is an orphan. And Toni has a most amazing reflection about childlessness and motherlessness. And the fact that in Shakespeare's Othello, everybody's having sex nonstop in insane combinations. And in the entire play, there are no kids. It's all Monica Lewinsky. It's all sex, 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 but no love and no children. It's power, it's people using each other, it's desperation, it's scary, and it's not love. And Toni has a great line saying, an orphan knows how quickly love can be withdrawn, which is a real theme in that play. So anyway, you see what you feel, but there's lots and lots of layers. That's what's so intense about Othello. My dream is that since Othello was taught in every high school in America, Othello by William Shakespeare, I hope a decade from now, taught next to it in the high school curriculum will be Desdemona by Toni Morrison, and it will create the conditions for a really interesting discussion of Shakespeare's Othello for the next generation or two. Yes, back there.
Peter, you've done amazing sleuthing into this play. And so, one, I'd like to know, where is that revealed that Amelia is having an affair with Othello, and how is it revealed? And why does Iago really hate Othello so much? Because that has never been clear to me.
Have you seen this yet?
No.
Tonight, okay. I won't answer the second question because you'll see that tonight. Toni really nails it. Meanwhile, there's an incredible moment after the Willow Song in Act 4 between Desdemona and Amelia. It's a very intricate scene. Othello's been in and out, screaming at her. Then he turns and screams at Amelia and calls Amelia a whore and a madam in front of Desdemona and then throws money at her. And Amelia's flustered and says, "I do not know what my lord imagines, madam." I think Desdemona's line is, "Whose lord?" And Amelia's line is, "My lord, madam." It's an intense exchange. And if you look at it, there's no reason for it to be there except between those two women. And from then, and at that moment, the next line from Desdemona is, "Get out of here." And she sends Amelia away immediately. And then the two of them are absolutely at dagger point from then on, which is why Amelia is so heartbroken at the end, because what there was going on between those two women was so awful. So it's painful stuff. But again, it's in Shakespeare, it's in 2 or 3 lines, like it is in real life when you're portraying someone and you just say one word and leave. And they get it. Anyway, it's super intense. And then the next scene with Othello, he's with Amelia, and they're speaking in very intimate terms. And look at that language. It's just totally erotic. It's not a nice conversation. It's super erotic. While she's trying to get him to come back to Desdemona, she's using an erotic encounter to do that. It's so crazy. But that's how you know it's human, right? If it's weird, it's human. And if people think they can get away with it, they try. And Shakespeare's Othello is people thinking they can get away with horrifying things and really trying. Yes? Yes?
This is a switch, but I'm curious about the stat, and I'd like to give you my impressions before I find out what it's really about. The light bulbs remind me as an visual echo of a microphone, but they also suggest interrogation and torture. To me, the bottles might be, in my imagination, a musical instrument, but I don't think so, because there's different musical instruments, very erotic and very colorful, while the bottles are very cold. So,
Wow. Did everyone hear that? Did everyone hear that? A fantastic meditation on these bottles could be musical instruments, but they're also cold. These light bulbs could be, illuminations, but also torture moments where people are being held, in solitary confinement. Interrogation. The set is, as I said, the main thing about the set is its microphones, because it's about a deep listening space. And I really love to make a space where you can just listen. And to me, that's what's missing. We have a society of spectacle, but not much listening. So I've tried to actually eliminate the spectacle and create only a deep listening space. Meanwhile, what you have on this on the stage are these glass around these fluorescent lights. There's a tradition from the southern Congo, the Bas-Congo, of people putting glassware over grave sites, over in cemeteries, and cemeteries filled with glassware, and and that's translated in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, to some African American communities going back, where there are plates or jugs, or sometimes entire rows of bottles, In some communities, the tradition is that it was the things that the deceased ate from in their last meal. So that when the spirits return, they feel welcome. They feel that there's the table set for them. They recognize all of those implements, and also that it's a vessel. It's a place you can be. And so the idea of a vessel as the site of return is a tradition within a certain part of the diaspora culture, and as I said, from a certain Congo and northern Angola, southern Congo. There's a fantastic, lifelong research by Robert Farris Thompson, and one of his great books is called Faces of the Gods, which is African altars from all over the world. And so a lot of that culture of altar making, what it means to make an altar, to make a site where the spirits who are waiting to console you can return, but also the spirits who are needing to be consoled can return. And that site of the return where the living and the dead meet, where you make offerings, where the offerings are consumed, where you remind people who died under painful conditions that you're still thinking of them, where there's a kind of solace, both for the victims and for the sad victors. And it creates a space of reconciliation, of rapprochement, of a shared space between the living and the dead. And at the same time, the sense of transparency, the sense of something, that's invisible, and at the same time, a vessel can hold and bear something, but it's also invisible. That idea that women are all vessels, that we're really in this world of vessels, that the spirit is speaking through a vessel. So that's the general drift. Anyway, everyone, please come tonight if you haven't seen it already. Meanwhile, may I just say, today was just the merest appetizer. Come tomorrow because you want to hear from Toni Morrison. She is spectacular and hilarious and brilliant. We have a team of brilliant scholars who are going to engage with her. Rokia will also sing, and we'll have a session on the Malian music that will be unmissable. So please, this is to treat today as a boring introduction to your experience tonight, and then tomorrow being with Toni and being with the scholars in the real debate, and we'll dig in. Okay? Thank you very much. Have a beautiful evening.